Hey everybody, welcome to the Orange and Brown Talk podcast. Dan Labbe, Mary Kay Cabot, Ashley Bastock back with you after a few days off. We're recording this on Monday at 4:30. So right off the top here, I just want to lay it all out for our listeners. This is going to be another week. We're a little bit short on pods. We're going to do 3 this week. We'll do extras if we need to, if something happens. We're going to talk about quarterbacks here shortly. If something happens that requires one, we'll certainly do one. But we're going to have another little bit of a shorter week with pods, and then we're going to really start hitting it hard next week. Mary Kay will be at the owners' meetings. Lance Reisland and Tim Bielek are going to start joining us every week for their draft pods leading up to the draft, which is a month away as we're recording this, which feels so close and so far away all at the same time. So we've got a bunch of stuff coming your way once that calendar turns to April, but just so you know, maybe a little bit of a lighter week on the podcast front, but still plenty to talk about. Mary Kay, it is, I mean, it's always quarterback week here with the Browns, but it's kind of quarterback weeks because they are off to pro days. As we're recording this, Cam Ward is having his pro day in Miami. Shador Sanders' pro day is coming up at Colorado. Tyler Shook is going to have his pro day. The pro day circuit is beginning, and that, of course, is an opportunity for the Browns to see these guys throw, but more importantly, maybe get some FaceTime with these guys, get to know them a little better, do some of that background work and that digging on all these guys. This is sort of an important time in this process.
It really is. This is when you put the finishing touches on your draft board and you really hone in and you really, really figure out how you're going to have those quarterbacks stacked. And I just remember being kind of struck by the fact that Sean Payton said that after the combine, I think it was, that he did not know that Bo Nix was his guy. He needed to go to the pro day, and then they needed to do a private workout before he realized that Bo Nix was the quarterback that he wanted to back his career on and put him forth out there and have him be the one that could make or break him. And so I do think you have to take it all the way to the end of the process. And you really have to get the coaches involved too, because when you're heading into the Senior Bowl, as we know full well, at that point, the coaches have not been involved. When you start to get Kevin Stefanski involved and Tommy Rees involved and Billy Musgrave involved, then you start to get a clearer picture of what the coaches want, who they want to work with, who they want to coach every single day. And I think that's huge, especially in the case of, let's say, a Billy Musgrave. I mean, he's been around for a long, long time. He's been a NFL quarterback himself. He's been a coordinator for 6 different teams, and he knows what he's looking at. So I think when you start to get opinions like that, I think it kind of changes the game a little bit. So it will be very interesting when we get to the end of this process, if those opinions have changed or swayed what the personnel guys were thinking, or if they're in lockstep and have been since day one.
I think that's the really fascinating part, Ashley, is just this idea. And I know we've talked about this before, but just this idea of like, are we going to get to April 24th and the Browns pick Shador Sanders, right? Which is sort of where we've been kind of circling all along. Like, yeah, it'll probably end up being Shador because it feels like Cam Ward's going to go number 1, but we'll see how that plays out. But or is it going to be, hey, maybe they end up not liking Shador. Maybe somebody in that building talks them out of Shador and they take Abdul Carter or someone else like that. We're getting to that point here where we're going to finally sort of find out what this team is thinking and if all of this Shador buzz and all of this Shador smoke has been legitimate.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so interesting in terms of the quarterbacks available this year that it just feels like most of the questions about him going forward are just directed at Shador. Like, you've seen Cam Ward's stock rise. You've seen Jackson Dart's stock rise. You've seen Tyler Shook's star rise. So all of those other guys are on like this upward trajectory. And we've talked about this before, but it's this idea of how calculated is this sort of negative Shador buzz in order to potentially manufacture a slide because it benefits somebody else. But again, I am curious. Like, I think there's a world in which the Browns look at him and just say, oh, like, he's not our guy because we like somebody else more. But those are all the things, of course, that we try to find out. We won't actually probably find out until that new rookie quarterback is here and we hear what their thought process was a little bit more, because when you're at number 2, you just can't afford to let your plans get out at this stage and potentially have somebody jump you even at 1 and take a guy that you're interested in because they also like him. It just doesn't benefit the Browns to really be that open and honest right now in terms of what they're thinking about these rookie QBs, Shador included.
Yeah, and I think too, as you go through this process, I think, if you're kind of sitting here watching these prospects, I think this happens too. And I have to imagine this happens in NFL buildings too. As this is such a long road, right? From during the season to Senior Bowl, Combine, all that stuff. It's just such a long process that I think it's easy to have a player's flaws get exposed more as you go through. Like maybe, like I'll just say this. So Shador Sanders is a guy, kind of the first couple times I watched him, like, okay, yeah, I see it. Like, I really like this guy. I understand why people look at him and say he's a fit in Kevin's offense and all this stuff. And, there was some, you'd see some bad games and some, like you do with every quarterback. And then I kind of went back and watched him again a little bit. And all of a sudden I let those flaws kind of stand out to me for some reason. And so I'm sure that happens in NFL buildings too, Mary Kay, where it's like, the things you don't like about a prospect, as this process just drags out, you think more and more about those. But I do think it's important to remember the reasons you loved a prospect in the first place.
Well, that is so very true. I'm guessing that I know that we could go back and look at all of Patrick Mahomes' weaknesses in all of those draft evaluations. It would probably be kind of funny to do that. Maybe we'll do that on a pod someday. We'll take some of the best quarterbacks that are in the NFL right now, like Lamar, like Patrick, like Josh Allen, and we will run through what some of the knocks against them were in this pre-draft process. Because what happens at this time of year, especially now when there starts to be a lot of time on everyone's hands, is you do pick these guys apart, completely pick them apart, and you start to lose sight of the prize of what is going to make them a good NFL quarterback. And a lot of people start to focus on the flaws and the things that they might not do perfectly. But remember, they were in college. They were not being coached 24/7. They were also going to school and doing other things. So you have to get a guy in your building, put him in the right environment, coach him the way that you want to, and you focus on those strengths and you build around those strengths and you supply them with all kinds of talent and you scheme for them specifically. So I think that this is the time of year where it's nitpicking and really it can hurt a player. And right now, and I wrote about this today in my update on what's going on with all of these rookie quarterbacks, and that is the fact that Dion actually believes that there is one football team that is telling lies about Shador to make him fall. And he knows who he thinks it is. He's not saying who he thinks it is, but it's obviously a team that's down a little lower somewhere, and they want Shador perhaps to get to them. And he believes that this is happening. I wouldn't be surprised. This is the time of year where all is fair in love and war, and it gets ugly, and it is a dogfight, and you've got millions of dollars riding on these decisions and these evaluations. You've got jobs riding on them, and it's a very, very difficult time to get things straight and to not let these players be the collateral damage in all of it.
And sort of along those lines, I'm torn by all of this buzz that is all of a sudden building out there around the Browns and Shador Sanders. It's always sort of been bubbling underneath, but over the last probably week or two, it's like people suddenly woke up and realized, like, hey, the Browns don't have a quarterback. And they're also paying a quarterback who's not going to play for them a ridiculous amount of money. So having a quarterback on a rookie deal would be really great for them. And, oh, the Browns are picking number 2 where they might have a chance to get a quarterback. It feels like all of this buzz is suddenly building around the Browns and Shador Sanders at number 2, stuff that we've been saying for months. And I don't know again, Ashley, we've talked about the smoke screens and the, what do you believe and what don't you believe? I don't know if I should just read that as like, again, maybe just the national media is picking up on this idea of, no, you got to have a quarterback. Or if this is the Browns almost trying to build buzz around, yeah, you know what? We really are going to take Shador Sanders. So what are the rest of you going to do? I don't know. It's, again, as we always say, you'd lie to anybody if you're in the NFL war
You
room.
would.
So I can't get a feel for any of it.
I can't either. And the mock draft I wanted to bring up was I just had a chance to go through Daniel Jeremiah's latest one on NFL.com, and we all look at his stuff obviously, but he still does not have the Browns taking a quarterback at number 2. He has Cam Ward going number 1 overall, which I think we're all in agreement that's just seems like how it's going to go right now. Either the Titans are taking him or somebody else is going to trade up. And he has the Browns selecting Abdul Carter, which I'm not really super crazy about that. We talked about that last week. I just think the edge rushers are so deep. And again, his rationale is he thinks because Carter is, so good, they should just wait and get a second tier QB. But then immediately after that, he has the Giants drafting Shador at 3. Like we keep seeing this, right? Where it's like, oh, the Browns should just pass. Just let it go. This guy's not good enough. But like 1 or 2 picks later, almost every mock draft has Shador going. And I think in his, he also had Jackson Dart going to the Steelers in the first round. I don't know. I'm to the point now, and I've talked myself into all these different scenarios. I famously did have them taking Abdul Carter in the very first mock draft I did. But the more we sit here and think about it, it doesn't make that much sense to me with how deep the edge rusher class is. And the fact that they have not been aggressive in getting a veteran quarterback, another veteran quarterback besides Kenny Pickett, because as we know, he's like the only guy in the room right now. I mean, Deshaun is obviously there. He's not going to play because of the Achilles, but you essentially just swapped DTR and Kenny Pickett. Kenny Pickett is not the big veteran signing. So I just don't think that without that aggressiveness that we can sit here and seriously say, oh, they're not going to expect a rookie to play right away. Like everything they're doing suggests to me that that's very much a possibility. And I think then you have to be aggressive at 2 and get the guy you like. So I just think it's funny looking at these mocks, though, that more often than not, it seems, Shador is falling to the Giants and everyone's like, oh, well, the Browns could do better with the second tier guy, I guess. But then everyone's like, well, the Giants really need a quarterback, so they need to take Shador Sanders.
Yeah, and they're almost in a similar situation as the Browns too, as far as job security, and like if you don't take a quarterback and that guy goes and is really good and your team wins 4 games, how do you justify keeping the guys you have in charge? There are a lot of similarities there. I mean, look, I could make the case for why you would take an Abdul Carter, and I think there is a case to be made for that. But again, it just kind of comes back to this quarterback, and you have to solve this. You have to figure it out and get it fixed. And that's on the top of the Browns to-do list here, Mary Kay, is fix the quarterback position. And right now it feels like the number 2 pick is the fastest way to do that, unless there's some developments on the veteran quarterback market. And of course, the big domino there is Russell Wilson. And over the weekend, the Steelers met with Aaron Rodgers for a really long time. I don't know what you talk about with Aaron Rodgers for 6 hours, but the Steelers did it. Jameis Winston signs with the Giants, although that doesn't sound like it's changing the Giants' plans necessarily or their interest in Aaron Rodgers, and I would assume Russell Wilson. But the dominoes are slowly starting to fall in the veteran quarterback landscape. It sounds like Kirk Cousins is, I know you've been reporting on Kirk for a while here, that probably nothing until after the draft. But I guess, and I've asked you this before, but again, I just think it's worth framing, right? Like we know Carson Wentz and Joe Flacco are placeholders. Is Russell Wilson a placeholder, or is he an answer?
It's a great question. I think that he, to a certain extent, is still going to be viewed as that bridge quarterback. It might change your philosophy a little bit, but I still think if you have your quarterback of the future available to you at number 2 and you believe that he is that guy, if you think Shador Sanders is that quarterback for you that can take you to the next level and take you to the playoffs over the next 5, 6, 7, 8 years, then I think you still have to take him at number 2, regardless of what happens with a Russell Wilson. He's 36 years old. He's totally on the back nine of his career. He's been with 4 teams in 4 years. I mean, you just don't put all of your eggs in that basket, and they are only going to sign him if they can get him at a bridge quarterback price. So I still think that they are looking at him more as a bridge than anything else. And if he was as good as a starting quarterback that you would definitely be plugging in there right away, then I think the Steelers would just be signing him and not be out trying to get Aaron Rodgers as an upgrade. So I think you have to take it with a grain of salt. I do think that there is a world in which he could start the season for the Browns if they sign him. But I still think that he's going to find himself at some point this season, probably sitting behind the rookie quarterback, whoever that might be.
Yeah, I think that's what I keep coming back to with Russ is this idea of he certainly thinks of himself a certain way, as he should, but the reality is Denver took on a huge cap hit for him to not play for them. The Steelers did make the playoffs with him, and they're out here courting Aaron Rodgers now, a year later. And there aren't a lot of job opportunities for Russ anymore. Everything has sort of dried up. It really is Cleveland, Pittsburgh, New York. So I don't know, maybe there's somebody else out there that could be a surprise, but there's not even a lot of job opportunities out there. So Ashley, I just don't think Russ has the leverage to look at a situation and say, well, I'm not going to be the starter for 17 games, so I don't want to go there.
No, it kind of feels like he's nobody's first choice right now. I mean, maybe in theory he is the Browns, but I would say you can't even know that for sure. But both Pittsburgh, the team he was just on, and the Giants are playing this game of chicken with Aaron Rodgers, and everyone let him get out of their building, so to speak, right? Obviously, the Steelers were in no rush to bring him back immediately. He left Cleveland after his meetings, met with the Giants the next day. There's been no decisions yet made by anybody in that regard. So I do think like this is not the market that existed for him. What was that, like 3 years ago? 3 years ago already when he was going to Denver, right? Or the
It was
yeah.
the same offseason as Deshaun.
Yeah. Yeah, so you're not going to get that same kind of deal, obviously, or opportunity, and not going to have the hopes of a team and like its future pinned on you in the same way. So, yeah, I think that part of it is interesting to me because it's like, oh, everyone's courting him right now, but he's like, I don't know, he's like everyone's second choice, and that's maybe a tough pill to swallow at this point because that's what it feels like from the outside looking in.
So, Mary Kate, when do you think we get some resolution here with these veteran quarterbacks? Is it really just going to be everybody has to wait for Aaron Rodgers, which who knows how long that could take? Or do you think one of these guys could just make a move at some point and say, you know what, forget it. We're signing Carson or we're signing Flacco or whatever?
I do think that the Browns will probably exercise patience and wait and see what happens with Aaron Rodgers and then what happens with Russell. I think the way that it was put to me was that the interest in Carson Wentz, the mutual interest in Carson Wentz, is contingent upon what happens with Russ. So I think they really want Russ first. And then if that doesn't work out, then they go to Carson. And I'm not exactly sure. I think the way that it would go after that would be Flacco after that, but I'm not even sure about that. It could be Russ, then Joe, then Carson, right? I mean, and maybe there's somebody else in the mix too that we haven't even necessarily mentioned or thought about. Maybe there's a surprise candidate in there somewhere. So I do think that they can afford to be a little bit patient right now because, as we've mentioned before, this is not their quarterback of the future that they're looking at. This is not Geno Smith to the Raiders. You know what I mean? It's not that. It's not Sam Darnold to the Seahawks. It's your bridge quarterback and someone who's probably going to make $6 million a year plus incentives to maybe get you up to $15 million a year, $60 million a year, which is what I think is kind of the parameters here. So I don't know that they're in any rush to get it done. This is a busy week for them. They're on the road all week. They're all fanned out. A lot of them are going to one place, some of them are going to another place, but they are going to these pro days and they're very focused on them. And then once these pro days are over, then they go to the NFL owners meetings. And sometimes things get put on hold a little bit or business gets done at the owners meetings. Sometimes things don't get done until after you get back from the owners meetings. So, there's a little bit of time here before they really have to do much of anything, or maybe they know something that we don't, and maybe Kirk Cousins is firmly still in the mix and that they're going to work through something potentially with the Falcons. That could still be in play potentially. I don't necessarily know if they want to give up draft capital for Kirk Cousins, and I think it's going to take that. I know it's going to take that. So I don't know how they feel about that, but that's another thing to consider, of course.
Well, I will say this. I'm doing a mock draft for Tuesday, and I'm realizing how many picks the Browns have. And it's actually making me be less opposed to giving up draft capital for Kirk Cousins, because I don't want them to make what is it? It's 10 picks, I think. I don't want them to make 10 picks on draft day. So let's talk Tyler Shough, because his pro day is on Tuesday. And so, Mary Kay, you turned some heads over the weekend. I saw your tweet while I was at the March Madness games in Cleveland, where you threw out the question, would the Browns take Tyler Shough at number 2? I watched some Tyler. I decided, I've got to at least watch a couple games of this guy. He can spin it. They have that striped ball in college football, and you see those stripes spinning. It looks pretty. His receivers let him down a lot, tons of drops. I don't know necessarily what to make of him. I see the vision. I guess walk me through this idea of why you floated out in that headline, the idea of, well, could they take him at number 2? And you mentioned it in your story you posted today too at cleveland.com/Browns, not necessarily saying they would, but just kind of asking that question.
Well, first of all, they are making him one of their top 30 visits. And they're not messing around with these visits. They're actually bringing in players that they might want to draft. And if you want to draft a Tyler Shough, I don't know that you would be able to afford to wait for him much longer than, I don't know. It's hard to say where a guy like that is going to go. He could go mid first round. He could go high first round. He could go third round. I mean, it's really all over the board. But if you like a guy well enough and you think that he could be your quarterback, and you like the traits that you see in him more than you like the traits that you see in Shador, there's a bigger arm there. There are some other things. If you like the traits better, then I think you have to take him where you are picking and where you don't run the risk of losing him. If he is your guy, take him where you have to take him. And don't worry about what anybody else thinks or if it's too high. I mean, if people think it's too high at number 2, why is it not going to be too high at number 8 or number 10 or number 15? We've talked about this so many times before. It doesn't matter what anybody thinks about where you're picking your quarterback of the future. All that matters is you find a guy, you settle on the guy that you really like, and then you do what you have to do to get him when you can. And if he, for some reason, is their guy, and I don't know that he is, I know they're intrigued by him. Otherwise, they would not be bringing him in for a top 30 visit. But if you really like him that much, then go ahead and take him where you need to take him. But it almost brings me back to my crazy idea of taking both Shador Sanders and Tyler Shough in some way, shape, or form, if you possibly can. But he's climbing so much now, I don't know if you would be able to even trade back into the first round and get him. And having said that, I'm sure people will take this clip when he goes in the 3rd round or the 4th round and, throw it back up in my face. But it's a crapshoot. Nobody really knows what a team is going to see in a guy like that and where they will be willing to draft him.
Well, yeah, and it's hard to read because his stock has risen so much. And this is just looking at the media draft people. This isn't seeing so we don't know what exactly what teams are thinking about him, but his stock has risen with some of these draft guys to the point where on their big boards he is in like the 30s, and he is in where you'd put him if you're just going best available throughout the first round. You would end up taking him pretty high. So I think that's what's interesting about the draft is the intel game and kind of figuring out, okay, we really like Tyler Shook. I don't know if we want to take him at number 2 because there's a world where we could get an Abdul Carter and a Tyler Shook, right? So let's do this. It's sort of the Patrick Mahomes Chiefs thing where Brett Veach found Patrick Mahomes, talked Andy Reid into him. Then they told John Dorsey, all right, figure out where we need to go to get this guy. And Dorsey makes the trade with Buffalo to get up to number 10 to get ahead of the Saints. That's all part of this game, Ashley, is, you could do the extreme thing where you take him at 2 just because you don't know if you're going to be able to get him. I don't know if they're going to have to do that, but you do have to figure out if he's your guy, where do we need to go? But like, what's the play here? How do we make sure that we land this guy with the understanding that you don't have complete control over what everyone else is going to do?
Well, and the other interesting part that for me makes it harder to predict what the Browns are going to do, like we know some tendencies of theirs, but they haven't had a first round pick since 2021. Like the sample size of Andrew Berry and this regime doing things in the first round is 2 people. It's Jed Wills and Greg Newsome, and that's it. I mean, in terms of their tendencies, we know like they are just not very prone to trading up. They're much more prone to trading back from an analytics standpoint. So I think it would surprise me if they were to do that. But yeah, it's like that idea is appealing to me. Like if you think there's somebody we like, we don't want to take him at 2, it is a gamble. But if you think, okay, we need to get back into the top 15 to get the guy we want, what can we trade to do it? It is feasible then where you get either Abdul Carter, Travis Hunter, whatever guy you want at 2, and the quarterback in the first round. But it's hard for me to imagine a scenario in which that happens just because they have been so averse to trading up unless somebody who they see really high value falling and that value is suddenly such a bargain, they have to go and get him like JOK. So it just all makes it harder to predict what they're going to do. But at the same time, we can say, this would kind of be out of character from everything we've known about them over the previous 5 years, too.
I think to me what this comes back to is like just don't be scared. Like if you love Cam Ward and he's there at number 2, or if you love Shador Sanders and he's there at number 2, then just take the guy and don't overthink it. Don't be scared to do it. Like I know Abdul Carter, people are throwing around the word generational with him. It seems like every 2 years we have a generational pass rusher, but you just paid a generational pass rusher, right? What's now the second richest non-quarterback contract in the history of the NFL. So you already have one of those guys, and you could also add another pretty good one at number 33 if you want to go that route, or even late in the second or whatever, early in the third. Like you can add another pass rusher and have a pretty good pass rush. I don't know. This just continues to be where I come back to, Mary Kay, and I'm sure there's people out there that are tired of hearing it. And we probably should just do a pod of like, hey, what if they don't take the quarterback at 2? But it's just, to me, you can't be scared to do this. You have to take your shot. And if it fails, it fails. But like, guess what? If they don't take a quarterback and they win 4 games next year, these guys might all get fired anyway. So I don't know. Why not just take your shot and see if you can solve this thing?
Yeah, that's exactly what I would do. And here's the other thing to think about. When everybody says that the Giants will take Shador at number 3 and then the Browns would do something else at number 2, why wouldn't you force them to come up to number 2 and then you get something else out of that? So absolutely 100% make them come up and trade for that pick. You're not going to just let him fall to the Giants at number 3. That would be dumb, in my opinion. I think you'd have to, I mean, if you're only moving back one spot and you're willing to take Abdul Carter, then you got to make the Giants come up so that you get something else out of this deal. You're still going to get the guy that you wanted. So That's another thing to consider there. But yeah, I think that they have to identify the quarterback or the quarterbacks that they like in this draft and go for it. Take them and develop them and build around them. And I've heard this said so often lately. I've heard the Browns say it, I've heard Andrew Berry say it, and that is so much of a quarterback's success or failure is dependent upon the environment that they are brought into. And when you look at Baker Mayfield, and that's a complex situation in so many different ways, but he wasn't brought into a functional environment. He was not. It was a recipe for disaster for him. The organization was not in alignment. The coaching staff and the personnel department were not in alignment. The personnel department itself wasn't even in alignment with each other. It was a mess. And it played out that way. And he was, once again, collateral damage of a dysfunctional situation. Now the Browns are functional. They are functional, and they are bringing the young quarterback into a professional and sound operation where everybody's operating on the same page, so much so that that's how they were able to work through the Myles Garrett situation and get him back here under contract with an extension, because they all stuck together. And that's what alignment can do for you. And if they're bringing a Shador or whoever into this organization, there's not going to be the infighting. I mean, there was so much infighting back then that it was like parents getting divorced and the child just getting his limbs pulled in two different directions. It was crazy. It's absolutely mind-boggling now when you look back and wonder how the Browns expected Baker Mayfield to succeed in that environment. And that's not what's going on here anymore. And that's why I do believe that Dion would be okay with Shador ending up here, which is sometimes why when I look at these mock drafts and I see everybody mocking Shador to the Giants, it's because I think that there isn't a whole lot of buy-in with people actually believing that Dion would allow Shador to play here. That's what I think a lot of it is.
Yeah, and I think to your point, I'm not like in love with this roster. I think there's a ceiling on this roster as it is right now, but this is not like, as far as bad Browns teams have gone, this roster's an NFL roster. You got the makings of a good offensive line. There's some holes. You've got at least a really good wide receiver in Jerry Jeudy, and then you've got some opportunities to bring in some other receivers, let a guy like Sed develop. Njoku, I don't know if we're going to get a repeat of last year, if he's going to come, whatever, but he's at least a competent tight end. Like, there's competence. There's a baseline of competence just on the roster in general, where you're not coming into this barren wasteland of a team that just has nobody on it. So again, I'm a little more pessimistic about the roster maybe than you guys are, but even when I look at it, it's like the quarterback that's coming into this isn't taking over an 0-17 roster with no offensive linemen and no defense. Not like there is a baseline, like there's a floor on this roster that is good enough to help support a rookie quarterback, and you can kind of build from there. So I think, again, Ashley, you don't force it if you don't love the guy, right? I'm not saying you just take a guy to take a guy, but if you are sitting there watching a guy, Cam or Shador, and you're like, you know what, we can make it work with him. This guy can fit with us. Then I think you got to do it. I think you got to pull the trigger on it, even if you're passing on a player who is thought of to be a better prospect.
Yeah, and I think with so many of these guys, like, because Cam Ward is probably not going to be available, I think there's going to be a lot of opinions coming from the peanut gallery, so to speak, if they do take a quarterback, about how high they took him, was it worth it? And again, to me, it just all is kind of silly right now, because in most of these mocks, everyone has the Giants taking a quarterback either way. So I've said from the beginning, I really think it's about them deciding how they feel about these guys, who they feel the strongest about, and going from there. Like, you can't say, oh, we really only like this guy, and if he's not there, we're just going to take Abdul Carter or Travis Hunter. Like, that's just not how they're going to be thinking. So I think it's, with it being the most important position, you have to decide, okay, we really like Shador, or we really like Tyler Shuck for these reasons. He's the guy. He can run this offense. He can be the franchise guy potentially of the future. And then you're going to have to be aggressive to figure out how to get him. Now, maybe there's another world where you get back up in the first round, but I think either way, you probably have to take that guy in the first round at this point.
Okay, there we go. Updates on the quarterbacks. It is pro day week. Obviously, there's some pro days into next week, too. I think Shador's is next week, but a bunch going on this week, including Miami's as we speak. We will cover it all leading up to the draft here at cleveland.com/Browns, also on this podcast. So make sure you're subscribed on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Find us on YouTube, Cleveland Browns, on cleveland.com. Instagram is Orange and Brown Talk. And on Twitter, X, we are Orange Brown Talk. So make sure you check us out on all those socials. For Mary Kay and Ashley, I'm Dan. Thanks for listening, everybody.